The millionaire tycoon discovered his grandson was returning home every day starving, despite always being packed a substantial lunch. He decided to place a recording device inside the boy's backpack, and what he heard next completely devastated him. Arthur Sterling didn't see his estate as a home. He considered it a fortress. At 60 years old, the man owned a sprawling real estate empire in London, but his greatest treasure was his 8-year-old grandson, Leo. After his son and daughter-in-law passed away, Arthur established the two of them in a strict, unbreakable order. Everything had to be perfect, from their sleep schedule to the precise calorie count in every meal. Arthur stood in the middle of his cold, marble-floored kitchen. On the counter was Leo's lunchbox, which had just been brought back from school. He didn't entrust this task to the household staff. He opened the lid himself. The inside was empty. He pressed his index finger firmly against the bottom of the box. It was bone dry. Not a trace of grease, not a single leftover grain of rice, not even a lingering scent of the gourmet beef stew he'd had that morning. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was dusting nearby. Noticing the contemplative expression on her employer's face, she spoke up. "The young master has a marvelous appetite lately, sir. Children that age are like bottomless pits. They just devour everything." Arthur didn't turn around. He held the box up under the ceiling light. "Mrs. Gable, I am a businessman. I know how to look at the numbers and the facts. Look here. This is not the result of a hearty appetite. An 8-year-old child never eats so cleanly that he doesn't leave a single smudge of sauce stuck in the corner of the container, unless it was scrubbed clean, or he left the sentence hanging, or it had never been touched in the usual way." His suspicious nature surged. Leo was an introverted child, timid, and notably awkward with his utensils. This meticulous cleanliness was an abnormality he couldn't overlook. Just then, the front door opened. Leo was home. The boy didn't greet anyone. He tossed his heavy backpack onto the living room sofa and bolted straight for the kitchen. Leo zipped past Arthur like a whirlwind, flinging open the refrigerator door. Arthur stood still, observing. He watched his grandson snatch a few slices of yesterday's stale sandwich bread. The boy shoved them into his mouth, wolfing them down as if he hadn't eaten in a week. With one hand, he grabbed a large bottle of milk, tilted his head back, and drank it down in a long gulp, milk spilling over his chin. Leo's face was pale, dotted with a clammy sweat, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. Arthur stepped closer, his voice low and razor-sharp. "You just finished a beef stew and mashed potato portion large enough for 2 adults? Why do you look like you are about to pass out from hunger right now?" Leo startled, dropping a piece of bread on the floor. He backed away, his spine against the open refrigerator door, and bowed his head. I was very active. We had soccer club at school. I ran around a lot, so I got hungry quickly, Grandpa." Arthur didn't believe him. He took Leo by the shoulder and turned the boy to face him. "Soccer? You've never liked sports. Look at me." Leo reluctantly lifted his head, but his hands were deliberately hidden behind his back. That furtive action didn't escape Arthur's notice. He firmly grabbed his grandson's wrist and yanked his hands forward. Under the bright kitchen light, Leo's small fingers were smeared with dirt, not ordinary dust. It was thick reddish clay embedded deep under his fingernails and smeared all over the cuff of his white uniform shirt. Arthur narrowed his eyes, his voice turning dangerous. "Your school spent millions of British pounds installing that pristine green turf last month. The playing field is as clean as a hospital floor. So where did this reddish clay come from?" "In this part of London, sticky reddish clay like this is only found in the thick woods behind the hill." Leo trembled, trying to pull his hands away, but his grandfather's strength was too great. The boy stammered, his breath coming in ragged gasps of fright. I fell in the corner of the field. They hadn't finished that spot yet. I didn't go anywhere. Please stop asking Grandpa." Arthur released his grandson. Leo's weak denial and his shifty eyes were a clear answer. The boy was lying. Someone or something was compelling his grandson to leave school, go into those filthy woods, and take his lunch. He felt his control being threatened. Arthur Sterling never tolerated being circumvented or outsmarted, especially not within his own family. He needed the truth, not the clumsy lies of a frightened child. "Go take a shower. We will discuss this later." Arthur issued the command coldly, then turned and strode straight toward his study. He closed the door, shutting out the sound of Leo's hurried footsteps running up the stairs. He walked over to his sturdy oak desk and opened the bottom drawer. His hand brushed past thick files and settled on a small black device. It was a specialized miniature digital voice recorder, the kind he often used in clandestine negotiations. Arthur clenched the device in his palm, his thumb lightly tracing the activation button. He peered through the door crack, watching Leo's small shadow disappear up the staircase. In his mind, hypotheses about extortion schemes or schoolyard intimidation revolved. Arthur couldn't wait. He needed to know exactly what was happening during the secretive lunch breaks Leo was hiding. The following morning, the living room was filled with sunlight, but the atmosphere between the two remained tense. Leo sat on a chair, awkwardly fiddling with the laces of his leather shoes. He hunched over, breathing heavily due to his clumsiness. Arthur stepped forward and picked up Leo's backpack. "Let me lend you a hand." Arthur didn't wait for Leo to reply. He placed the backpack on his lap, pretending to brush dust off the outer fabric. His fingers quickly moved to the small utility pocket at the bottom. With a utility knife concealed in his palm, Arthur made a small incision just large enough to slip the recording device deep into the lining fabric. The movement was swift and precise, like the signing of a lucrative deal. "There you go. Don't forget the lunchbox Mrs. Gable prepared. Today you have roasted chicken." Leo took the backpack, his expression still gloomy. "Yes, I know. I'm off to school now." Arthur watched his grandson leave for the car. When the door closed, a current of tension ran down his spine. This was no real estate transaction. This was a campaign to reclaim the truth in his own home. At the Sterling Corporation headquarters, stress permeated the corner office on the 40th floor. His secretary, Sarah, entered clutching a stack of thick documents. "Mr. Sterling, the shareholders are in conference room 1. They are waiting for your approval on the plan to acquire the East London land parcel." Arthur stared at the wall clock. It was 10 a.m. Leo's lunch break was in 2 hours. "Cancel the meeting, Sarah. Tell them I have an urgent, unavoidable family matter." Sarah froze the stack of papers, nearly slipping from her hand. "But Mr. Sterling, you have never canceled a meeting for personal reasons. The shareholders will not be pleased." Arthur rotated his chair. His gaze was so icy it silenced her instantly. "I pay you to execute my orders, not to question my priorities. Get out." All day, Arthur didn't touch a single file. He sat in his glass-walled office looking down at the stream of people who looked like ants on the street below. His mind was torn between the image of a well-behaved Leo and the hypothesis that some unsavory individuals were compelling his grandson to perform a clandestine activity. He wondered where he had gone wrong in his parenting, or if his own excessive control had pushed the boy away. The afternoon dragged on. When the car carrying Leo returned to the mansion drive, Arthur was waiting right by the entrance. He walked over proactively, taking the backpack from his grandson's hand. "You look tired, Leo. Go take a hot bath. I've told Mrs. Gable to prepare some sweet pastries for you." Leo nodded weakly, his heavy footsteps dragging as he went upstairs. The instant the sound of running water echoed from the bathroom, Arthur immediately locked the study door. His hand trembled slightly as he retrieved the recorder from the bottom of the backpack. He plugged it into his computer, put on the headphones, and began to scan the audio. The first segments of sound were just the rustling of textbooks, the steady voice of the teacher lecturing, and the students' hushed chatter. Arthur fast-forwarded. 12:15 p.m. This was when the sound changed. Instead of the clink of a fork hitting a plate in the cafeteria, Arthur heard the metallic zipper of the backpack being opened. Next came the hurried sound of footsteps pounding on hard concrete. Leo's rapid breathing registered clearly through the recorder's microphone. "Hurry up, we are going to be late." Arthur heard clothing scraping against a metal fence, followed by the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot. The boy was not on school grounds. He had climbed the fence and escaped. The wind began to whistle louder, indicating Leo was moving through a desolate open area. Arthur gripped the leather chair armrest. Images of the woods behind the hill flashed in his mind. His frail grandson was running from the safety of the school to a place no one knew about. Why would he take such a risk? Who was waiting for him at the end of that path? Suddenly, Leo's footsteps stopped. There was the sound of heavy metal being dragged along the ground. The grating, ear-splitting sound of rusted metal scraping together was loud and drawn out. A large iron gate was being opened. Arthur held his breath, his finger pressed tightly against the headphone, his eyes staring wide into the void. Immediately following the sound of the iron gate closing, another sound emerged so faint he nearly missed it. It was the sigh of another person. The space in the recording was quiet for a few seconds. Then a woman's voice came through, raspy and shaky. "You came again. The wind is so strong today, I was afraid you wouldn't be able to stop by." Arthur froze. This voice held none of the harshness of a blackmailer. It was filled with gentleness and expectation. He waited for a cry or a plea from Leo, but his grandson responded in an excited tone Arthur had never heard at home. "I promised I'd come, Auntie. My house made delicious cream sauce salmon today. Please eat it while it's warm. I had to sneak an extra portion of bread." The rustling of food wrappers followed. Arthur clearly heard the faint clinking of silverware against a ceramic plate. Then came the slow, difficult chewing sounds of an elderly person. "You've given me your portion again, haven't you? You look so much thinner." "I'm not hungry, Auntie. I eat plenty at school. Just eat, please. Seeing you enjoy your meal makes me happy. At home, I don't have anyone to sit and talk with like this. Grandpa is always busy with his numbers and his buildings." Arthur tightened his grip on the liquor glass in his hand. A numbing sensation spread through his chest. It turned out he had been providing Leo with the most expensive meals while leaving the boy lonely in his own mansion. Leo was not the victim of intimidation. He was a devoted provider. He was willing to go hungry in exchange for someone who would genuinely listen. In the recording, the woman seemed to have tasted the salmon. She took a deep breath and spoke in a choked voice. "This dish. My little brother Artie used to love it. He could eat 3 servings and still ask for more. You cook just like my mother used to." The liquor glass in Arthur's hand slipped from his trembling fingers. It crashed onto the hardwood floor, splintering into 1,000 pieces. The spirits splashed onto his fine leather shoes, but Arthur paid it no mind. The name Artie reverberated in his head like a thunderclap. 50 years ago, in a destitute orphanage on the outskirts of Birmingham, there was a boy named Arthur. Everyone there called him Artie. And only one person had the right to call him by that name with affection, his older sister Martha. The current Arthur Sterling was a famous real estate tycoon, but the Artie of the past was a petty thief. He had emptied the meager savings Martha had put aside to treat her failing eyesight, then fled to London to build his own empire. He changed his last name, changed his first name, and promised himself never to look back at that impoverished past again. He succeeded, but the price was the betrayal of the only family member who had ever shielded him from physical discipline. Arthur rewound the tape. He clung to that raspy voice. Time had ravaged Martha's voice, but the way she mentioned the salmon and the name Artie was unmistakable. "Artie must be so rich now, right? I don't know where he is, but I believe he's the best man in the world. He's probably busy saving the world somewhere, so he hasn't had time to come back for me." Every word she spoke was like a dagger to Arthur's self-esteem. He realized his decades of cowardice. He had the money, he had the power, but he never dared to face the sister who had sacrificed her eyesight for him. And now, by a cruel twist of fate, his own grandson had been led to her to fulfill the duty he had shirked for half a century. The fear of having his true identity exposed mixed with a frantic craving that rose within Arthur. He couldn't sit here and listen through an inanimate device anymore. He needed to see her. He needed to know if the sightless woman living in that dilapidated structure was truly Martha. Arthur sprang to his feet, pushing the leather chair back. He didn't call the housekeeper, nor did he notify his driver. He yanked the headphones off the computer and threw them onto the desk. Arthur walked straight to the coat closet by the door, took down a dark raincoat and pulled a hat low to obscure his face. He quickly descended to the garage, ignoring the gleaming luxury cars. He proceeded to the far corner of the garage where the gardener's old mud-caked pickup truck was parked. He reached for the spare set of keys hanging on the wall. Arthur started the engine. The old machine sputtered and roared to life. He sped out of the mansion drive, heading straight for the hill behind Leo's school. It was starting to get dark, and the first raindrops of the season lashed violently against the windshield. Arthur floored the gas pedal, his eyes glued to the muddy trail ahead. He had to get there before Leo left, or before the fear inside him won once more and forced him to turn back and run away. The pickup truck sped into the sparse woods, its tires skidding on the thick reddish clay. Arthur saw the silhouette of the Blackwood estate ruins appear faintly through the rain. He slammed on the brakes. The vehicle skidded for a moment, then stopped abruptly, right in front of the rusted iron gate, which was standing ajar. The 50-year-old secret had been exposed. Would Arthur have the courage to face the sister he had left behind in the shadows? Don't miss the tycoon's journey to reclaim his soul in the next chapter. "What on earth are you doing, Arthur?" he asked himself in the rearview mirror. "Are you running away, or are you trying to find yourself?" Arthur parked in an alley far from the school gate. He sat still in the truck, his eyes fixed on the crowd of students bustling during the lunch break. The cold of the drizzle seeped through the car door cracks, chilling his skin. Arthur waited patiently. He saw other children chasing each other on the pristine green turf, their laughter echoing. Then Leo appeared. His grandson wasn't playing with anyone. The boy clutched his backpack to his chest, looking around with the caution of someone concealing a major secret. Arthur held his breath as he watched Leo quickly walk toward the rusted iron fence in the corner of the sports field. Leo expertly slipped through a small gap hidden by the dense bushes. The boy disappeared into the sparse woods in the blink of an eye. "How many times have you done this, Leo?" Arthur whispered, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He opened the car door, got out, and walked toward the fence. Arthur squeezed through the gap, feeling the rust scrape his coat shoulder. The woods opened up before him with slippery, winding paths. Thick, reddish clay began to cling to his custom leather shoes. Arthur frowned slightly as the thick mud ruined the surface of the polished leather, but he didn't stop. The deeper he walked into the woods, the more familiar the terrain became to Arthur. He stopped in front of a rotting wooden sign hanging loosely from a chain, "Private Property, Blackwood." Arthur froze. This was the very piece of land his corporation had tried to purchase 3 years ago. He had planned to level the entire ruin to build a high-end apartment complex. The project was canceled due to complicated legal disputes over inheritance rights. He once called this place London's garbage dump. Now that very garbage dump was sheltering his only grandson. The sound of a dry branch breaking under his foot jolted Arthur back to reality. He tiptoed, following Leo's small footprints pressed into the mud. At the end of the path, the ruins of the Blackwood mansion appeared with its dilapidated conservatory frame. The glass panels were shattered, leaving only a black iron framework that looked like the skeleton of a monster in the forest. Arthur hid behind a large oak tree, its rough trunk concealing his tall figure. Through the broken glass panes, he saw Leo. The boy was kneeling on the ground. He took a white handkerchief from his backpack and carefully wiped the silver spoon that Arthur often saw during their fancy dinner meals. Leo opened the lunchbox. The smell of beef stew wafted through the damp, musty space. "Auntie, this dish is very tender today. Please eat another bite." Leo's voice was so gentle that Arthur felt his chest tighten. At home, Leo always answered him with short replies, trembling for fear of being wrong. Here, the boy resembled an adult man full of compassion and responsibility. Arthur saw an elderly woman huddled on a pile of old, tattered blankets. She wore layers of dust-caked wool sweaters, her wrinkled hands shaking as she reached out to take a bowl of soup from Leo. The boy fed her one small spoonful at a time, patiently waiting for her to chew and swallow with difficulty. "You're giving me your portion again, aren't you?" "You look so much thinner, Leonard." The old woman spoke, her voice raspy like dry leaves rubbing together. When the old woman lifted her face to catch the weak light filtering through the leaves, Arthur felt his heart stop. His entire body went numb. A cold current ran down his spine. The light illuminated her face, revealing a long scar running from her forehead down to the corner of her eye. The scar was raised, wrinkled with time. Arthur would never forget that scar. It was Christmas Eve 50 years ago. Their stepfather came home in an intoxicated state, holding a piece of rope and venting his rage. Arthur was just a 10-year-old boy, skinny and terrified. Martha had lunged forward, hugging her little brother tightly, absorbing the entire onslaught for him. That scar was a testament to the sacrificing love she had for him. Martha, Arthur whispered, his lips trembling without sound. Memories rushed in like a flood. He remembered the day he ran away from the orphanage. He had stolen her money, the money she saved for her eye surgery, just to buy a train ticket to London in pursuit of wealth. He had promised to come back for her when he succeeded. But wealth possessed a frightening allure. It made him ashamed of his past, making him want to sever all ties with poverty. He chose to forget the sister who was waiting for him sightless. Now she was sitting there, his Martha. The sister who had yielded her future for him now, living as a destitute person in the ruins he himself had once intended to demolish. And his grandson, by the instinct of shared blood, had found the person he had deliberately lost. Shame and guilt crashed over him like a tsunami, more powerfully than any financial crisis he had ever faced. Arthur felt small and cowardly underneath the cheap raincoat. He didn't know what to do. He didn't dare to step out. He was afraid her dull eyes would see through the hollow soul of a millionaire. Arthur stepped back once, then twice. He wanted to vanish before he was detected. But in his panic, his foot inadvertently came down hard on a dry oak branch hidden beneath the decaying leaves. Crack. The sound rang out dry and unnaturally loud in the quiet space of the sparse woods. Leo startled and sprang to his feet, shielding the old woman. Martha also tilted her head, her keen, sightless ears directed toward the oak tree where Arthur stood. "Who is that, Leo? Is someone there?" The old woman's voice trembled with alarm. Leo squinted at the bushes, his hand grasping the silver spoon like a defensive weapon. "Grandpa, is that you?" Arthur stood frozen in the shadows, his breath caught in his throat. A cold sweat streamed down his forehead. He knew he had no way out. His secret, his guilt, and the past he had painstakingly buried all stood on the verge of being exposed right now. Arthur hid behind the oak tree, his heart pounding, as he saw both Leo and Aunt Martha looking toward him. He wanted to step out, call his sister's name, and drop to his knees in apology, but his feet were nailed to the thick mud. The fear of judgment was greater than the bond of family. Arthur spun around and bolted. He ran wildly through the blackberry bushes, letting them tear at his cheap raincoat. Arthur rushed toward the old pickup truck, his breath ragged and his chest aching. He started the engine, slammed the gas pedal, causing the tires to spin wildly in the mud before the vehicle shot forward. Arthur was fleeing from the sightless eyes of his sister and the simple goodness of his grandson. He was running from the true man he had painstakingly concealed for half a century. Arthur reached the mansion when darkness had fallen. He slipped into the house through the back entrance like a thief, avoiding the sight of the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. In the bathroom, he frantically washed himself with hot water. He wanted to use the soap to scrub away the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the odor of cowardice clinging to his skin. Arthur stood before the mirror, looking deep into his weary eyes. He wiped the last streaks of mud from his neck, then began to put on a luxurious suit. Arthur's hands trembled violently as he attempted to tie the silk necktie. It took him 3 attempts to complete the knot. He put on his gold watch-sprayed expensive cologne to conceal all traces of the woods. Arthur Sterling, the real estate mogul, had returned, but his mask of success was cracking into large shards. He walked down to the dining room, where the crystal chandelier shone brilliantly, attempting to maintain a composed demeanor as if nothing had happened. Leo was already seated at the dining table. The boy looked exhausted, but tried hard to appear well-behaved. When the dinner plate was served, Leo began to eat ravenously. He chewed quickly, swallowing each piece of meat as if this were the only meal he would have all day. Arthur sat opposite him, holding a fork but not touching his food. He watched his grandson, his heart heavy, knowing the reason behind this hunger. The silence in the dining room became stifling, broken only by the sound of silverware hitting the ceramic plate. "Is the food to your liking tonight, Leo?" Leo startled, quickly swallowing a mouthful of rice. "Yes, it's delicious, Grandpa. I'm just eating a little fast because I'm hungry." Arthur stared at his grandson, his voice as cold and direct as if he were interrogating a fraudulent business partner. "And how about the old woman in the Blackwood woods? Did she enjoy the salmon lunch today?" The sharp clink of a silver spoon dropping onto the ceramic plate broke the silence. Leo froze, all color draining from his face. He looked at his grandfather with terrified eyes, his lips quivering. The room seemed to be deprived of oxygen as Leo realized his biggest secret had been exposed. You were following me?" Arthur did not raise his voice. He leaned back into his chair, his eyes filled with weariness. "I wasn't following you. I just wanted to know why my grandson was losing weight every day. Now tell me the truth. Don't tell me another lie." Leo began to sob. Hot tears streamed down his cheeks, falling onto the still full soup bowl. The boy cried as he recounted his skipping school, the sightless old woman living in the greenhouse, and the stories she told about a bygone era. "She's so poor, Grandpa. She has no home, no food. She's blind, so she can't go anywhere. I couldn't just watch her starve. She said I was her only friend for many years." Arthur felt his heart constrict. His 8-year-old grandson was doing what a powerful millionaire had never dared to do. But the true emotional blow came when Leo spoke about the old woman's little brother. "Do you know she told me about her little brother all through lunch? She calls him Artie," she said, "Mister. Artie is the smartest and kindest person in the world. She said he must be in a very far-off place saving the world or busy doing great things, so he hasn't been able to come back for her. She said she would wait even if she had to wait another 50 years. Arthur felt a dull ringing in his ears. Saving the world. He had only been busy accumulating properties numbers in his own arrogance. In the eyes of his sightless sister, he was still a hero, a small brother who needed protection. Martha's blind faith and kindness tore apart the last shred of self-respect in Arthur's soul. He realized he was not a successful millionaire. He was a traitor, a craven soul wearing a $1,000 suit to conceal the emptiness within. She also said if she ever saw Mr. Artie again, she wouldn't be angry. She just wants to know if her brother's being fed and kept warm. Leo wiped his tears with his uniform sleeve, looking straight into Arthur's eyes. "Grandpa, she's not a bad person. Please don't chase her away. I'm willing to go hungry so she can eat." Arthur could not endure it anymore. Leo's clear, compassionate eyes were like a mirror reflecting all the wickedness in himself. He felt revulsion toward his own reflection. Arthur sprang to his feet, the force of his movement sending the heavy wooden chair crashing backward. He didn't say a word to Leo, abandoning his stunned grandson in the middle of the dining room. Arthur walked unsteadily, clutching his chest as if trying to keep his heart from shattering. He rushed out of the dining room past a stunned Mrs. Gable standing in the hallway. Arthur headed straight for the staircase leading down to the mansion's basement. This was where he stored the things he never wanted to look at again, the memories of a time he called shameful. Arthur's heavy footsteps echoed on the cold stone steps. He made his way to the darkest corner of the basement, where an old safe was concealed beneath a dust-covered black cloth. His hand trembled as he touched the combination lock. He needed to find something he had deliberately forgotten 50 years ago to begin his new life. Arthur descended the stone steps leading deep into the basement. The chill from the old brick walls enclosed him. He walked past shelves of expensive wine, where each bottle was worth a common man's fortune. Arthur proceeded to the farthest corner behind a large oak rack, where a small old safe lay hidden under a thick layer of dust. It had been 30 years since he last touched it. Arthur placed his trembling fingers on the combination dial. He closed his eyes, recalling the sequence of numbers he had intentionally buried. A soft click sounded. The heavy iron door swung open, releasing the smell of metal and old paper. Arthur pulled out a rusted metal tin, its lid firmly jammed. He used force to pry it open. Inside were no gold ingots or valuable real estate contracts. The first thing he touched was a yellowed black and white photograph, its four corners curled. In the picture, a thin-faced teenage girl was hugging a small, dirty boy tightly. Martha was shielding him with a tattered umbrella during a downpour. At the bottom of the box was a brittle piece of paper, the ink faded. It was the I-O-U he had scribbled in his clumsy teenage handwriting. "Sister Martha, I owe you a pair of eyes and a life. I will return to repay you. Artie." Arthur sat down hard on the cold basement floor. He clutched the photograph to his chest, letting his tears fall onto the rust of the tin. The musty smell of the basement instantly transformed into the scent of the old orphanage. He remembered the bone-chilling cold of those Birmingham winters when the two siblings had to huddle together to keep warm. He remembered Martha's thin hands always yielding the last crumb of bread to him. What have I done? Arthur wondered in the darkness. I built skyscrapers, but I let my only family live in ruins. I have all the money in the world, but I am the poorest man." He realized that all his success, all the respect he had painstakingly built, was just a veneer for a traitor. His wealth was meaningless if it couldn't buy a word of forgiveness from the sister who had sacrificed her future for him. Regret choked his heart, making it impossible for him to breathe in the cramped space of the cellar. The clock struck 3 a.m. Arthur stood up, wiping his tears with the sleeve of his expensive suit. He didn't return to his bedroom. He walked straight up to the mansion's modern kitchen. Mrs. Gable came downstairs from the upper floor, surprised to see the kitchen lights on. She automatically moved to help. "Mr. Sterling, do you need anything? Let me prepare some tea for you." Arthur shook his head. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the loaf of bread on the counter. "No, thank you, Mrs. Gable. Please go back to bed. Today I will personally prepare Leo's lunch. I need to do this alone." Mrs. Gable paused, looking at her employer's determined but pained expression, then quietly withdrew. Arthur began to work. He ignored the gourmet ingredients in the refrigerator. He took out a simple loaf of sandwich bread. He cut the slices, spread a thick layer of butter, and sprinkled white sugar on top. This was scorched butter and sugar toast. Back then, whenever he earned a few pennies collecting scrap metal, Martha would buy a piece of bread and make this for him. To them, it was the most luxurious thing in the world. The smell of toasted butter began to spread, filling the cold kitchen with a fragrance of the past. Arthur stood before the toaster oven, watching every second to ensure the edges were slightly scorched exactly the way Martha used to make it. He worked meticulously, as if this were the most crucial project he had ever undertaken. When the slices were still piping hot, Arthur carefully wrapped them in parchment paper. He pushed aside the expensive insulated lunch boxes. He walked toward the old storage closet near the kitchen, rummaging through the neglected items. Finally, he pulled out a dented old aluminum lunch pail covered in dings and imperfections. This was the only relic from their impoverished days that he had accidentally kept during a house cleaning years ago. He wiped the lunch pail clean, placed the slices of toast inside, and closed the lid. The old aluminum lunch pail looked utterly out of place in a kitchen worth tens of thousands of British pounds. But for Arthur, it contained an entire sky of memories and the weight of atonement. "Leo, we won't be going to school as usual this morning," Arthur whispered to himself. He placed the aluminum lunch pail on the dining table right next to Leo's familiar seat. He didn't go to sleep. Arthur brewed a strong cup of black coffee and pulled up a chair to lean against the kitchen counter. He sat there motionless, his eyes staring out the east window, where the faint streaks of dawn were beginning to appear over the London sky. Arthur knew that when the sun rose, his life would turn a new page. He was no longer the millionaire Sterling. He was Artie, and he was preparing to embark on the most important journey of his life, to face the truth. Leo's small footsteps echoed from the staircase. The boy appeared in his neat uniform, his eyes still holding the anxiety from the previous night's conversation. Leo paused when he saw his grandfather already seated in the kitchen with the strange aluminum lunch pail on the table. Arthur stood up. He walked over to his grandson and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Leo, put on your shoes. Today I will take this lunch with you." Leo looked at the lunch pail, then at his grandfather, surprise evident on his face. "Where are we going, Grandpa?" Arthur opened the main door. The cold air rushed into the house. He looked toward the woods behind the hill and replied with a resolute voice, "We are going to bring my sister home." Arthur took Leo's hand and stepped out the door, leaving the brilliant chandelier light of the mansion behind, heading straight for the old pickup truck waiting in the early morning fog. The old aluminum lunch pail was ready for a journey of redemption. Would the flavor of the past be strong enough to mend the brutal scars of time? Join us for the tearful reunion in the next chapter. The early morning fog swirled around their feet, cold and thick. The gardener's old pickup truck was parked right there, mud-caked and out of place among the meticulously trimmed flower beds. Arthur opened the car door, waited for Leo to climb into the passenger seat, and then walked around to the driver's side. That morning, the strict order of the Sterling mansion had completely disintegrated. Arthur didn't check Leo's buttons, nor did he remind the boy about class time. When Leo put on his heavy backpack and stood waiting by the door, as usual, Arthur merely walked up. He yanked the backpack from his grandson's shoulder and tossed it onto the expensive leather sofa. "There's no school today. You sit right there." Mrs. Gable stood in the hallway, her expression bewildered as she saw her employer take the wheel of the high-clearance vehicle himself instead of waiting for the private chauffeur. "Mr. Sterling, your schedule is fully booked today. The driver is also preparing to take the young master to school." Arthur didn't look at her. He pulled out his phone and quickly punched a sequence of numbers. "Cancel every meeting. Tell the driver he has the day off. No one is to call me." He threw the phone into the console. Leo sat beside him, clutching the old aluminum lunch pail tightly. The boy looked at his grandfather with anxiety, but dared not ask anything further. "We are going on an outing, Leo. A long overdue trip." Arthur stepped on the gas. The truck sped away, its tires squealing on the smooth paved road before turning onto the shortcut. The rain began to fall heavily. Large drops lashed against the windshield, creating blurry streaks. Instead of following the paved road around the hill to the school, Arthur steered the truck straight onto the dirt road leading to the edge of the woods. This road was typically only used by logging trucks, muddy and full of deep potholes. The luxurious vehicle bounced violently. Thick reddish clay splashed onto the truck's body, obscuring the gleaming paint. Arthur's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Every time the truck skidded on the mud, his heart clenched. The loss of control of the vehicle in the stormy rain was exactly what was happening in his mind. He was afraid. This was not the fear of failure in the business world, but the fear of standing before a sightless woman and saying, "I've come back." "Grandpa, can you slow down a little? The toast is going to get squashed." Leo spoke up, breaking the tense silence in the cabin. The boy still hugged the aluminum lunch pail to his chest. "Is it still warm?" "Yes, it's very warm. She likes to eat it when it's still hot. She says butter and sugar toast is only delicious when eaten immediately." Arthur glanced at his grandson. Leo was not afraid of the speed or the rain outside. He sat there calm and full of trust. This child's composure became the anchor that kept Arthur from turning the car around and fleeing again. "Do you think she will recognize me?" "I don't know, Leo. 50 years is too long. I've changed too much, haven't I?" "She said she remembers Artie's smell and voice. She said even though she is blind, she will know if you are standing near." Arthur was silent. He pressed the gas pedal harder. The truck passed the last puddle of mud and stopped abruptly right at the edge of the woods. The engine roared once and then died. Arthur turned off the ignition. Outside, the rain obscured the entire oak forest. Arthur sat motionless in the driver's seat, his hands still on the steering wheel. He stared out into the downpour. Just a few hundred yards ahead, beyond those bushes, was the sister he had abandoned half a century ago. He took a deep breath, feeling his chest tremble. Arthur opened the car door. He got out without bothering to take the raincoat from the back seat. The rainwater immediately drenched him, soaking his gray hair and his $1,000 suit. He walked around to the other side, opening the door for Leo. Arthur held the large black umbrella shielding his grandson and the aluminum lunch pail. "Let's go, son." The two of them began to walk. Arthur's custom leather shoes sank deep into the slick mud. The mud climbed up his trousers, staining the expensive silk lining. But Arthur no longer cared. Every step he took now was heavy with regret. He was no longer the famous real estate millionaire of London. He was just a younger brother returning home with empty hands and a soul full of scars. They walked through the dense bushes. The sound of the wind whistling through the oak leaves sounded like a lament. Arthur felt his legs grow heavy as he saw the rusted iron frame of the greenhouse appear faintly through the rain. He stopped right at the threshold of the greenhouse. Broken glass shards lay scattered beneath his feet, reflecting the sky's gray light. Arthur intended to step inside, but his feet stiffened. He stood frozen there, his hand shaking, about to drop the umbrella that was shielding Leo. From inside that damp and dark space, a sound emerged. It was not shouting or weeping. It was a melody. A raspy, weak voice was humming an old lullaby. Arthur stopped dead as if struck by lightning. The melody was exactly like an echo from another lifetime. He recognized every note, every rhythm she used to soothe him on those stormy nights in the orphanage years ago. The hand holding the umbrella shook violently. He stared into the darkness inside, his breath caught in his throat. "You're here, Leo. You're later than usual today." The woman's voice sounded gentle, but it completely paralyzed Arthur. He felt the umbrella in his hand, slowly slipping away. Arthur stood frozen right at the greenhouse threshold, his hand clutching the black umbrella. Rainwater from the broken roof poured down right next to his feet, splashing onto his mud-caked leather shoes. He couldn't move another step. All the confidence of a famous millionaire vanished the instant he heard the sound emanating from within the damp, dark space. It was the steady rhythmic tapping on the side of a rotting wooden chair. That dry sound accompanied a raspy, weak singing voice, occasionally interrupted by bouts of coughing. The voice was humming an old lullaby about a silver moon and faraway fields. The melody was far from smooth. It was off-key, out of tune, and carried the burden of half a century of loneliness. But to Arthur, that melody was like an electric current running deep into his memory. He remembered the stormy nights in Birmingham 50 years ago when the two siblings huddled under the orphanage table to escape the sound of thunder. Back then, Martha also tapped the rhythm on the table leg and sang this very song to lull him to sleep. That song had been locked tightly in a secret drawer of his soul, where he stored everything related to the impoverished Artie. Now that melody was like a master key, turning gently and swinging open the door to the past, making Arthur feel not like a 60-year-old man, but the 10-year-old boy trembling with fear. Leo stood beside him, noticing his grandfather's strange slowness. The child couldn't understand the weight of that melody. He only wanted to quickly deliver the warm lunch to his friend. Leo let go of Arthur's coat, abandoning the umbrella's shelter, and ran into the darkness of the greenhouse. "Auntie, I'm here. I brought your butter and sugar toast." Leo's call made the melody abruptly stop. A loud noise rang out like metal striking stone. Martha flinched, dropping the old plastic cup she was holding. She couldn't see anything. She only heard strange footsteps in the call. She stumbled backward awkwardly, her trembling feet tripping over the pile of tattered blankets. "Who is that, Leo? Who did you come with?" Aunt Martha recoiled into the damp corner where withered vines clung to the wall. Her frail hands frantically groped in the air. She touched a dry piece of firewood and clutched it tightly like a final weapon for self-defense. "Don't chase me away, please. I haven't harmed anyone. I'm just sheltering from the rain here. I will leave as soon as the rain stops. Please don't call the police." Her stammered plea was like a slap across Arthur's face. He stood out there in his expensive suit and watched the sister who once protected him from the whole world now tremble in fear of a single figure. She had grown so used to being driven away, being considered society's refuse, that her first reaction upon meeting a stranger was to beg for clemency for her very existence. Arthur could not stand still any longer. The black umbrella in his hand slipped onto the muddy ground. He stepped inside the greenhouse, ignoring the rainwater pouring directly onto his shoulder from the cracked roof. His footfalls crunched on the broken glass shards. Arthur moved closer, seeing Aunt Martha gasping for breath, her sightless eyes wide but unfocused, directed toward him. "Auntie, it's okay. This is my grandpa. He brought food for you." Leo ran up and held the old woman's hand, trying to calm her. But Martha was still frantic. She sensed a large presence, a strange scent of expensive cologne mixed with the smell of the forest rain. She swung the wooden stick in her hand, inadvertently striking Arthur's shoulder as he approached too closely. Arthur did not flinch. He accepted the blow as a punishment. He stepped through the puddle of water, casting aside all arrogance, all fame and status. Right in front of the destitute old woman, the millionaire Arthur Sterling dropped to his knees on the dirty, damp floor. Mud splattered onto his knees, staining his neatly pressed trousers. Arthur didn't care. He knelt there, bowing his head before the sister he had betrayed. This was the symbol of the total collapse of the monumental ego he had constructed over 50 years. Who are you? Why are you kneeling there?" Martha stopped waving the stick. She felt the warmth and the rapid, short breaths of the man right at her feet. She was still guarded, her frail, calloused hands reaching forward to examine him. Arthur remained silent. His throat was choked, unable to utter a single word. He brought his large hands up gently but firmly, taking hold of her trembling ones. Martha's hands were icy, her skin wrinkled and rough like old bark. Arthur felt every small scar, every callus on his sister's hands, the traces of a lifetime of hard labor. He pulled her hands closer, pressing them tightly against his own face. Rainwater and tears mixed together, soaking into the old woman's palms. Martha froze. She intended to pull her hands away, but the warmth from the man's face made her pause. "Leo, what is your grandfather doing?" "His hands, why is he crying?" Leo stood beside them, quietly watching his grandfather. The boy saw the family's man of steel become so small and vulnerable for the first time. He said nothing, only standing there as a witness to a wordless dialogue between the past and the present. Arthur held Martha's hands, slowly guiding them to move across his face. He brought her index finger to his forehead, then down to his high cheekbones. Aunt Martha began to fall silent, her lips trembling. The sense of touch of the sightless began to register familiar contours that she thought she had forgotten half a century ago. Finally, Arthur slipped her rough fingers down toward his chin. Right on the left side of his chin was a small crescent-shaped scar. It was the mark of a time when Arthur fell off his bicycle as a child, and Martha had used the only clean piece of cloth in the house to bandage her brother. That scar had never faded, no matter how many expensive products Arthur had used to conceal it. Martha's finger stopped right on that scar. She traced it lightly, repeating the motion several times on the scarred surface. Her breathing suddenly became ragged. The entire greenhouse seemed to contain only the sound of the rain lashing outside and the terrifying stillness inside. Arthur closed his eyes, holding his breath. He felt his heart dangling over an abyss. Just one word, one recognition from her, and his entire world would change forever. Martha suddenly pulled her hands away as if burned, her sightless eyes shaking violently. This scar," the old woman whispered, her voice completely lost. She reached out again, this time with both hands, clutching Arthur's face with a mixture of utter panic and desperate hope. Arthur still knelt there, unmoving, waiting for the destined moment he had fled for 50 years. The melody of the lullaby from earlier echoed in his mind more intensely than ever. He opened his mouth, but only a choked sob emerged. Aunt Martha's frail hands were still clasped to Arthur's face. The wrinkled, rough fingers began to move. She traced the high bridge of his nose, then slipped down to his trembling cheekbones. Everything in the greenhouse seemed to stop. There was only the sound of rain lashing against the broken glass and the heavy, desperate breathing of two people who had entered the later stages of life. Aunt Martha suddenly stopped at Arthur's left hand, which was holding hers. Her index finger touched his pinky finger. It was a slightly crooked finger, the result of a fall and break when they were at the orphanage. Since they had no money for treatment, it had healed itself in a distorted shape. Arthur still wore a plain gold ring on that very finger because no other finger would accommodate it. Martha's sense of touch paused. She traced the crooked joint again and again. Her entire body began to tremble. "Artie, is that you? Is that my Artie?" The old woman's question echoed like a call from the abyss of time. Arthur could not restrain himself any longer. He buried his face in her palms. A choked sob broke loose after half a century of suppression. He cried like a child, no longer the powerful real estate tycoon, no longer the man of steel in London. "It's me, Martha. It's me. Your terrible little brother has come home." Arthur's weeping tore through the musty atmosphere of the derelict structure. He dropped completely to his knees, his shoulders shaking violently. "I'm so sorry. I took the money. I ran away. I was so afraid of poverty, so afraid of the darkness of the orphanage that I left you behind. I swore I would succeed and come back for you, but then I grew afraid of my past. I was a coward, Martha. I had everything, but I had nothing without you." Aunt Martha did not push him away. She offered no blame. She wrapped her other hand around her brother's gray hair, pulling him close to her chest. Tears cloudy from her sightless eyes mixed with the rainwater on Arthur's suit. "Artie, it's enough that you came back. I don't need the money. I don't need the buildings. I just needed to know you were still alive, that you were fed and warm. I waited for you for so long, but I never stopped believing in you." Leo stood nearby, clutching the aluminum lunch pail. The boy watched his grandfather, the man he always perceived as imposing and distant, now reduced to tears in the arms of the destitute old woman. Leo felt a surge of warmth spread even though the wind howled all around them. Aunt Martha struggled to reach into the tattered lining of her sweater. She fumbled for a moment and pulled out a tiny object carefully wrapped in a scrap of old brittle fabric. She opened the cloth with trembling hands. Inside was a tarnished copper button engraved with a small anchor. "Look, Artie, the night you left this button came loose and fell onto the floor." I picked it up. For 50 years I've carried it with me. I told myself that as long as I kept this button, you would surely return someday so I could sew it back onto your coat. I was afraid if I left this area, you wouldn't be able to find me. Arthur looked at the copper button resting in his sister's calloused palm. It was the very button from the old jacket he had been wearing on that fateful night. Martha's forgiveness was like a final devastating blow to the last vestiges of arrogance in his heart. She had lived in darkness, in hunger, and in solitude, just to maintain a fragile belief in her treacherous little brother. "You kept it for 50 years in this abandoned place. It was the only thing that let me know you were real Artie. Some nights when it was too cold, I thought I had forgotten your face and I would touch this button. It gave me the strength to go on." Arthur took his sister's hand holding the button and kissed it with profound reverence. He wiped his tears, then reached for the aluminum lunch pail from Leo. "Martha, I brought this for you. Do you remember the scorched butter and sugar toast you used to make for me whenever we had a few pennies?" Arthur opened the lid of the lunch pail. The fragrant sweet smell of toasted butter spread through the space, overpowering the musty scent of dampness and forest rain. The aroma immediately smoothed out the weary lines on Martha's face. She took a deep breath, her toothless lips trembling. Arthur broke off a small piece of toast. He carefully blew on it to cool it, then gently brought it to his sister's mouth. "Eat this? I made it myself. It's the same recipe you used to make the edges have to be slightly scorched to taste best." Martha parted her lips and accepted the toast. She chewed slowly, as if savoring every bit of the essence of her memory. "The flavor is right. It tastes just like Artie's from long ago." Arthur continued to feed his sister one small piece at a time. He looked at Leo and signaled for his grandson to come closer. "Leo, come here to your grandpa and your auntie. This is Martha, the person who nurtured my soul before I became blinded by money." Leo nestled into the embrace of the two adults. Arthur wrapped his arms around his sister and his grandson. 3 people, 3 generations, sat huddled on the dirty floor of the broken greenhouse, but their hearts were beating with a shared warmth. "We are not staying here any longer, Martha. I am taking you home, a real home with a fireplace, good food, and us. I'm afraid I'll soil your house, Artie. I'm just a poor, sightless old woman." Arthur tightened his grip on his sister's shoulder, his voice more resolute than ever. "You are the richest person in that house, Martha. You and Leo saved me from the poverty of my own soul. I will not allow you to stay here for another second." The rain outside began to lessen. Only small tap-tap sounds on the glass roof remained. Arthur stood up. He didn't bother with his $1,000 suit or his muddy shoes. He bent down, wrapping his arms around Martha's back and legs. "Hold tight to me, Martha, just like the old days when you carried me over the puddles after the rain." Arthur lifted his frail sister into his arms. She was so light it made his heart clench once more. He walked steadily out of the greenhouse, heading toward the waiting vehicle. Leo held the umbrella over the 2 adults, his footsteps echoing on the muddy ground. "Grandpa, can we put her in the room with the window overlooking the rose garden?" "Yes, Leo. She will have everything she wants, and we will never let her wait for a meal again." Arthur placed Martha into the soft back seat of the car, covering her legs with his warm coat. He looked back at the Blackwood ruins one last time. This place was no longer a garbage dump to him. It was where he had found his soul. The pickup truck's engine started. The headlights pierced the slowly fading fog. Arthur drove out of the woods, leaving 50 years of regret behind, heading toward the bright light that was beginning to emerge at the end of the road. The man who stepped out of the sleek black car was Mark, head of security for the Sterling Corporation. He saw the gardener's battered old pickup truck parked by the muddy woods next to his esteemed chairman, who was in the most disheveled condition imaginable. Mark started to rush forward, his hand reaching for his communication device, but Arthur raised a hand to stop him. "Stand still, Mark. Don't frighten her." Arthur, carrying Martha on his back, walked with steady steps across the last puddle of mud to the paved road. Though he had turned 60, his legs had never felt stronger. Martha's weight on his back was featherlight, so light that Arthur's heart tightened with sorrow. She was merely a skeleton wrapped in skin. Her breath on his neck was weak like a thin wisp of smoke. But to Arthur, this was the sweetest burden he had ever carried. It weighed more than all the multi-billion-dollar contracts, more than the monumental ego he had painstakingly constructed. Leo walked alongside them, straining to keep the black umbrella completely over his aunt. The boy didn't notice that his own shoulder was soaked. The three of them left behind the ruins of the Blackwood estate, the place that had imprisoned Martha in darkness and solitude for so many years. Mark opened the car door. "We are going straight to St. Jude's Hospital." Mark fumbled as he opened the door of the gleaming limousine. Arthur carefully settled Martha into the plush back seat. He took off his own soaking wetsuit jacket and draped it over his sister's cold, trembling legs. "Mr. Sterling, should I notify the press or your assistant the afternoon schedule?" Arthur looked Mark straight in the eye. His gaze no longer held the coldness of a businessman, but the conviction of a man who had just rediscovered his soul. "Cancel everything. From now until my sister recovers, I have no schedule other than being by her side. Go." The car sped away as the rain began to dissipate. Arthur sat in the back seat, his hands still tightly holding Martha's dry, brittle one. Leo sat beside her, resting his head on his aunt's shoulder, his eyes sparkling with joy. At London's premier private hospital, Arthur Sterling's disheveled appearance caused a small sensation, but he paid no mind to the curious stares or the hushed whispers. Arthur used his power and wealth to mobilize the finest doctors and the most advanced equipment, all to serve one sightless, destitute old woman. "I want my sister to receive the absolute best care. Money is no object. I want her to feel like she is in her own home." Arthur spoke to the head physician in a commanding but urgent voice. For the following days, the celebrated real estate tycoon was no longer seen at trading floors or aristocratic tea parties. Arthur kept a 24/7 vigil by Martha's bedside. He refused all calls from the corporation, delegating all authority to his vice presidents. Every morning, Arthur personally brewed tea for Martha. He learned how to comb his sister's tangled gray hair. His hands, accustomed only to signing multi-million-dollar deals, were now surprisingly gentle and adept. Martha sat on the pristine white hospital bed, her sightless eyes directed toward the window where birds sang in the hospital garden. "Artie, this bed is so soft. I'm afraid I might get lost in all these pillows." Arthur smiled, placing the cup of tea in her hand. "You deserve it, Martha. You slept on tattered blankets for far too long." I just worry I'll get used to this luxury and forget the smell of the forest wind. But having you here makes me feel so much peace." Leo's presence was the most precious remedy for Martha. Every day after school, instead of having the chauffeur take him home, Leo would go straight to the hospital. The boy brought storybooks, sat on the floor by the bed, and read to Martha. Leo's clear, innocent voice echoed in the luxurious hospital room, driving away the smell of chemicals and the coldness of the machinery. "Auntie, listen. Today at school I learned about birds. There's one kind of bird that flies thousands of miles to return to its old nest." Martha smiled, her toothless smile radiant. "Just like your grandpa Leo. He also flew very far and finally found his way back home." Arthur sat beside them, quietly peeling an apple. He observed the bond between his sister and his grandson, his heart filled with an unprecedented sense of peace. He realized that for so long he had built skyscrapers to mask the emptiness in his heart, but it was his 8-year-old grandson who built the bridge that connected him back to his family. Leo not only saved Martha's life with his lunchboxes, but he also saved Arthur from the frigidity of greed and the loneliness of old age. A month later, Martha's health had greatly improved. She was no longer completely sightless following a small surgery Arthur had insisted upon. Although she could only perceive blurry images, the world had brightened for her again. Martha refused to live in Arthur's mansion because she preferred the companionship and noise of people her own age. Arthur respected his sister's wishes. He purchased the most upscale retirement community on the outskirts of London, one with vibrant rose gardens and kindly elderly residents. That Sunday afternoon, golden sunlight streamed down onto the retirement community garden. Arthur, Leo, and Martha sat together on a long wooden bench beneath an ancient oak tree. The breeze blew gently, carrying the scent of flowers and freshly cut grass. "Artie, look. Leo is running around just like you used to." Martha pointed toward Leo, who was chasing a butterfly near the flower bed. Arthur smiled, folding the financial newspaper, a task he would never have interrupted before. "He has your heart, Martha. He knows how to love others even before he knows how to love himself." Arthur reached for Leo's backpack on the small wooden table. He opened the boy's lunchbox. This time, it was no longer a solitary container. Arthur had personally prepared 2 neatly divided portions in a brand new double-tiered lunch pail. One portion was packed with nutrition for Leo, and the other contained soft butter and sugar pastries for Martha. "Time to eat, Leo. Come here, son." Leo ran over his forehead beaded with sweat. He took his portion and began to eat heartily. There was no more rushing, no more exhausted hunger from the days he skipped school to go to the woods. Leo ate while telling stories about his new friends at school, about how he no longer had to lie to his grandfather. Arthur watched his 2 loved ones enjoying their lunch in simple happiness. He looked down at his own hands, his fingers no longer clenched with power or money, but were ready to embrace those he cherished. He felt that the empty lunchbox in his soul for the past 50 years, the one that held regret, deception, and loneliness, was finally full. It was not filled with bank account numbers, but with Martha's forgiveness and Leo's kindness. The afternoon sun began to fade. Leo's laughter rang out joyfully in the garden. Arthur leaned back against the bench, closed his eyes, and inhaled the fresh air. He knew that from now on, every day would be a new beginning. The story is a modern parable about the true value of wealth and the power of forgiveness. Arthur Sterling had all the money but lived in poverty of the soul, while the young Leo possessed the most precious treasure, a heart that shared without expectation. The greatest lesson is this: kindness is the only language that can bridge every distance. We are often so preoccupied with building materialistic towers that we unintentionally imprison ourselves in solitude, forgetting that true happiness lies in genuine connection between people. Money can buy gourmet meals, but it cannot buy the warmth of family love or peace of conscience. Leo used his empty stomach to awaken the dormant humanity in his millionaire grandfather. This reminds us, never let pride prevent your steps from returning to your roots. Forgiveness not only saves the recipient, but also frees the giver from the chains of the past. Ultimately, the thing that truly fills the lunchbox of life is not luxury goods, but profound compassion and genuine presence for one another. Note: the preceding story is entirely fictional. Character names, locations, and plot points have been constructed for the purpose of artistic and educational illustration. Any resemblance to actual people or events is purely coincidental.